Hello there, everybody. Welcome back to Star Wars Lads. Today, we're talking about it finally. The Acolyte is here. The first two episodes just came out on Disney Plus about a couple hours ago, hour and a half ago. So, we're going to talk about the first two episodes of The Acolyte. Obviously, full spoilers. So, if you have not watched the episodes yet, go watch them, come back. We might still be streaming by the time you're finished watching. This stream will go for about an hour and a half, and we will discuss all things Acolyte, all things Star Wars, really. This is our weekly live stream. So if you do have questions or comments about other things that are Acolyte, there's not really much out there in the world of news outside of Acolyte right now. But if you do have something and you would like to discuss it, send it into the chat. We would love to hear your thoughts on the Acolyte. Outside of that, there's not too much to discuss. So make sure you send in those chats. We will answer them after we give our review. We start these streams out by giving you our review, our thoughts, our takes on the Acolyte. And this week we'll be talking about the first two episodes of the Acolyte, which were about 40 minutes ish with credits, both coming in under 40 without credits. Sonic, let's start with your thoughts here. What were your thoughts on the Acolyte episodes 1 and 2? And did it live up to your hype in your head? Was it better than you thought it was going to be? What were your thoughts on the Acolyte?
Yeah, I mean, I think this was a really fun start for the show. I definitely want to rewatch it, and it does give me a lot of the same similar feelings that I had when Mando season one first came out, right? When that first live action Star Wars show was out there, and you kind of understand the tone of what they're going for, but it's a completely new world, right? There might be some iconography, there might be some things that concept wise that are the same as the Star Wars that you've seen in movies or animation, but it wasn't something that immediately grabbed me, but as the first episode really went on, I started becoming a lot more of a fan. And I think that's because I'm definitely a fan of Amanda's performance here. If you've seen the two episodes already, she's playing two roles here, and it is a bit of a tough act to ask someone who's an entirely new newcomer to Star Wars to just be like, "Hey, you're not only the lead, but you're playing both the villain and a potential hero lead at the same time." And I thought that would be a bit of a challenge, or maybe something to be explored a little later. But since they pushed that up to the front, that definitely hooked me pretty quickly. I thought some of the CGI shots were really fantastic. It still suffers a little bit from some of that. And I know they didn't use the volume, but some of like the closed-ish spaces, especially in that second episode in that
Mm-hmm.
fight scene between Saul and May. But for the most part, this was the most visually interesting and different Star Wars show we've had. I was even trying to see if there were like things that could jog through my memory of like High Republic ships and stuff like that. But really, it was just that vector that we see one passing
Right.
shot of. So it's fresh, it's new, and it's taking me a little bit to get into. But I think that second half of episode one onwards, I really got hooked into it. And then that second half of episode two, that intrigue starts building up. The twists and turns are definitely there. And Osha is not just a character that happens to be on this journey and has been seeing some weird visions. Now she's becoming more of an active player.
Mm-hmm.
And the Jedi that are involved, right, who you would assume best based on archetypes, like a great example of Saul being characterized very similarly to Qui-Gon. Now you're like, okay, clearly some things that went on 16 years ago that he's not admitting to fully. Like even on the file for OSHA, they didn't mention May, and now he's like reacting very
Mm-hmm.
strongly to Master Vernestra, who, I mean, I guess if that's a High Republic reference for you, there you go. But we don't really know anything about her, and she is pretty new for most people. But she was like, no, we do this as a committee. We think about this. We have meaningful discussion. And the way he's been like slowly almost like cracking and becoming more judgmental and all that, it was pretty interesting to me. So now like the onus is like, okay, is episode three gonna deal with like the story of what happened here? I'm excited now. I definitely am liking where we're sat at in the story. The only thing I'd really like critique right now without having seen a rewatch is the last 30 seconds of each episode. I'm not really sure what they're kind of going for. It almost feels like teases for next week sort of thing or for the next episode. I didn't really love the first one in the episode one because I was like, okay, I guess we could see our villain, but that was really weird and random and kind of cut the pacing. At least the
Yeah.
second one, I feel like it's naturally like, okay, we got to deal with a Wookiee. There's Jedi. We've been hearing the villains and the heroes' perspectives talking about them. Okay, now we see them. But it's not like we even get like much of a shot of Kelnaka. He just like yells at some guy speaking Huttese and then walks into a ship and then the episode ends. So I'm not a fan of how they're ending. I am a fan of everything before then. I think if I rewatch it, I'll really like these episodes. But for now, like 2 thumbs up. It's different. It's how I felt exactly with Mando season one, episode one. And upon rewatch, I love that a lot more. So I'm expecting to have a lot of the same feelings here with this double episode premiere.
Yeah, my thoughts are similar in that I would say for me it's like a one, maybe 1.5 thumbs up. I like this, and I like the story and the mystery. That's what I'm intrigued about. Like Colton is saying in the chat as well. I'm excited to keep watching. I think that's the thing that these first 2 episodes did was they made me intrigued. I want to see what happens. I want to see what the mystery is. I want to see how it unfolds. I want to see what the weird connection is between these twins. I want to see how that all plays out. The twin dynamic is something that's interesting that really has only been explored by Luke and Leia. Unless you've read Legends, then you have Jason and Jaina, but they're fraternal twins. There's a connection element, but there's something different when it's identical twins, the same face on 2 different people, dark side and light. I think that's an interesting idea. And so going into that idea, they have a chance to make this, at least story wise, really unique and different. I do agree with you, though. A lot of things visually and a lot of the story construction, I thought there were some flaws, and I'm hoping it's just to get these kind of first couple episodes out of the way. But if the episodes don't, you know, get better structurally, then I'm a little worried that maybe structurally we're in for a show that probably should have been at least longer episodes, if not a whole nother like season before this plot. Because I found a lot of the exposition here to be incredibly over the top. Um, it looks like I'm having an issue again, Cynic. I'm not sure what's going on, but I don't know if that's for our stream. Don't know if you can tell. There's YouTube's giving me a flag here. It seems
Yeah,
like it's going okay.
I think it's going okay. I'll keep
Okay,
tabs on.
let's hopefully that's just a problem. Let me know in the chat, everybody, if my video is coming through solid. I think it's just YouTube giving me a notification about something. But let me know if anything cuts out. Last week we were having problems with my video cutting out for some reason, so let us know if that cuts out at all in the chat, and then we'll get back to it. But back to my review. I honestly felt like the pacing of this was incredibly fast, almost Rise of Skywalker-esque, but I don't want to say that yet because it's we're only 2 episodes in, so I'm trying to give the show a chance to breathe. But at the same time, the show doesn't choose to breathe, and I don't know if that's studio mandated. I don't know if it's the way it's written, but it does feel like it's cut to the bone. There's not much in terms of just letting things chill and exist and breathe. The characters don't have time to just chat. I'm a big person with exposition. It drives me insane, and not just in Star Wars. I look at this for everything I watch, and it drives me absolutely insane. That's why I absolutely hated Rebel Moon. But there's this show had a lot in episode 1 that was like, you're this person and you did this and this in the past, and then 5 years ago you did this, and then that's why this happened because you did this and you did this, and that just like that flag in my mind just went, oh no. And that's why I say like maybe we should have had some type of like prologue to this, or an extra 10 minutes where you see the fire that they talk about a million times, right? I feel like we're going to get that eventually in a flashback, but I found it weird that that wasn't in this episode, because the whole thing is about this mystery, right? The first episode seems to be building towards the mystery of like, okay, is Osha May? Does she have her mind like warped to where she is actually May? Are there really twins? Is she just lying? The first episode tries to build that to you, and then by the end of it, they're just like, no, actually, they're two different people. They're twins. So that mystery is kind of pulled out and completely vanished. And because of that, then you have this like dynamic that we could have seen, like I think it's very Last Jedi inspired, Rashomon inspired, like the multiple perspectives, right? We have May who thinks the Jedi killed her family as started the fire. Maybe that's true. We don't know. We haven't seen what actually happened. The Jedi think May did it. And so there's this whole conflict of like different point of views, which I think is really, really cool. That could be an interesting dynamic, but we haven't seen what it looks like yet. And in a lot of ways, I kind of wish there was like a prologue that started there and then jumped into the main story a few years later. Just something to give a little bit of weight to some of the things that are being discussed and thrown out in the show. Like we have, as Star Wars fans, we're trained to listen to this stuff, right? We're trained to retain this information quickly and to just go, okay, yeah, that happened. But the film side of me, the film brain side of me, is going, this exposition is really over the top when we could have just seen some of this stuff. So I don't want to go too negative because that was my biggest critique. I did actually enjoy the characters. I think they're starting to get going. We're starting to see more about them. Obviously, can't judge them off of 2 episodes because there's still a lot more to them. I think Master Soul is going to have an incredibly interesting journey throughout this. I think Osha needs a bit more to her. There's something off there, but I think that's intentional. I think there's going to build in that mission. I did really like Yord and Jackie's
Yeah.
relationship. I thought some of those moments were really fun, and I thought it was pretty funny. Some of the ways Yord interacts, like he's like Obi-Wan to the max, like with zero fun. And I think that's a pretty fun idea to have that type of Jedi, very reminiscent of the type of Jedi who would be young in this time, who's going to transition the High Republic into the prequels, right? So I thought that was cool. I love references like to the Barash Vow and stuff like that to High Republic and the larger Star Wars universe. All that was really cool. Good choreography for the most part, and some surprise twists and turns. So I enjoyed the show. I'm looking forward to what is coming. I can't wait to see this mystery unfold. And like you said, Sonic, the fact that it's new, I think, is the most exciting. Like this is new,
Yeah.
it's different, and that keeps me wanting to tune in because ultimately it's not a prequel story. We don't know where it's going to end up, like we kind of do with Andor, or we kind of do with some of the other stories we have throughout the live action Star Wars. So overall, enjoyed it. I think the writing and everything will get better. I think it will pace out a little bit better as we get further and further away from the intro. But I absolutely agree with you about the little tags at the end. They just seem really out of place,
Yeah.
and I think the condensed nature of these episodes, it just makes it feel way too tight. It's all too boxed in. It's like you get a wipe and then all of a sudden there's a tag and then we're done. Um, I do like though that they're going with like some more traditional Star Warsy things like the crawl, a version of the crawl, and then we also have the Star Warsy outro with the iris out and all that. So very cool. I like the all that type of stuff. Still very mixed on like the actual quality of the storytelling so far, but I think the interesting dynamic, the interesting characters, and the interesting plot makes me really excited for it every week. But yeah, a little bit of a fast start for me. But let us know what you guys think. You have a lot of comments rolling in there. I don't know if you want to respond to anything I said, Sonic, before we get into the comments. But we'll just dive into your comments if not. And then if you guys haven't liked the video, please do so. Helps us out a lot with the channel, helps us get to more and more people. And if you're just joining us and missed our discussion a little bit at the beginning, obviously, if you've been watching live, full spoilers on the last 2 episodes. So if you haven't watched them, that's your warning. And then send in your questions, your comments, your theories, your reviews, anything you'd like to discuss about the Acolyte or Star Wars in general into the chat. We will get to them as soon as we can. If you want to make sure you get a chat sent to the top, send us a super chat and we will definitely get to it ASAP. It does help out the channel greatly. And we always appreciate the support. And if you are new, make sure you subscribe. We will be covering the Acolyte every single week. And as always on our channel, we do predictions and speculation videos every week, talking about what we think might happen in the next episode. So back to you, Senek. If you have a response to that at all, or if you want to just move into the comments, let's move into the comments.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just to make a note of your exposition, right? Like it is totally fair, and I think that is the challenge of making this from the start an ensemble show, right? Mandalorian just has like the archetypes. It's the guy who's silent. He doesn't have to do anything other than stand there, look cool, and it's his mystery that drives us. But the plot isn't necessarily mysterious, right? It's just his day-to-day activities before he takes on a job. Here with the Acolyte, it's been positioned as a mystery. It's been explained in the crawl that this is a time of peace, but they're on the edges of the galaxy. People are being taught the Force and learning mysterious powers. And I think a lot of the exposition comes from the fact that they're really just trying to shove it out there very quickly. I think this is definitely a show that I could just tell my mom to watch, and she would not need to know anything about Star Wars, and she could be fairly comfortable. And I think for us, in some ways, like I know what you're saying from the filmmaking perspective. I totally agree. It is a little obtrusive, but I think at the same time, you kind of do need this exposition if you're going to jump us with 8 to 10 characters so far. Like
Mhm.
we've seen, and that too, when you have twins, I most viewers online, like they might say, oh yeah, that's pretty easy to distinguish, but not everyone would have caught that twist until it was revealed. So I do think they are kind of hand holding, full agreement there. But I'm a little bit more pleased that it was a little bit lessened in the second episode. It
Yeah.
just does feel like now it's the dialogue that needs to feel a little less structured and a little bit more naturalistic. Like everyone is on edge, everyone's just trying to do their job, but nobody's really talking, right? And I think that is what's going to start opening up. I think if we drop the flashback, and if we finally get to meet Kilnaka, and now that everyone's prepared and can maybe give him like warning ahead of time and all that, I think that will ease a little bit of like this concern that we're definitely feeling. But I don't think it's gonna be like that for the whole for the whole show. It really does feel like they're trying to make this a flagship show, but they're like, it is a flagship show, but we might have given you too many characters to start off with and dropped into a pretty complicated story that has a lot of twists. So maybe the studio's mandating, like, all right, just get all that stuff done first, do whatever you want afterwards. Or maybe
Mhm.
that's how it was written, but I don't expect this to like really linger and continue in episode 3 and 4. I feel like I liked a little bit more of the dialogue and the flow of it by the time the second episode ended.
All right. Well, fair. Those are all fair points. I do agree. The second episode I found to be much better. I think it felt like it stood on its own versus needing a ton of backstory. I agree. We do need the exposition. I think they could have found better ways to do it.
Yeah.
Um, but ultimately, when we get to the end of this mystery, when you have a mystery show, when you get to the end of the mystery, if it's satisfying, I think we'll ultimately enjoy it and forget about some of these flaws from the start. Like I guess in one positive, we want to look broad, a bigger picture positive for this show. There have been very few Star Wars shows that have had tons of exposition in the beginning. They usually decide to drag it out as long as possible,
Yeah.
and then we never actually get a satisfying conclusion. So maybe we'll get a satisfying conclusion because we're getting all this stuff out of the way at the beginning. Let us know what you guys think in the comments, and then now we'll start going through your comments. So if you just joined again, send in your questions, your comments, your theories about the Acolyte, what you think might happen in episode 3, what you think of these first 2 episodes. If you had anything you loved, if you didn't like things, let us know in the comments. We'll bring it up here in the chat. We're going to go about an hour and a half. We're almost at 20 minutes. So we'll be going another hour and 10 minutes or so. So keep those chats flowing. It will be the thing that stems our entire conversation. So we have a couple comments here from Anthony Tiff. Thanks for joining, Anthony. I believe your second week in a row, right? Joining us. Appreciate your support. Just done finishing the Acolyte. It was awesome. I especially liked Master Soul. I like the fact he was from Squid Game. Sad thing is that so many people I've seen on Reddit and YouTube said woke. I like Master Soul a lot too, and I think he fits the show really well. I think he's a solid actor, and I think there's something really interesting and different around Soul. And obviously, what's kind of sad though, Cynic, is just to talk about episode 3 a little bit. Maybe I really hope Kelnaka doesn't die. I think I want to see a Wookiee Jedi like really be strong and good in live action. Because Buryaga has been great, and I'm almost done with Temptation of the Force, and I've loved how they've used Buryaga in that. I really wanted to see some great Wookiee Jedi action. I think we'll see some good action, but they're kind of setting it up for Soul to be the last person alive of the 4 Jedi that were there that kind of remembers what was going on, right? So you're going to have his perspective versus May's perspective. And then you're going to have that whole thing about how does the brainwashing of the Jedi, right? How does Soul's memory of that imprint on Osha's, and how does Osha start to maybe open up her mind and remember a bit differently? I do think we're setting it up to have the Jedi possibly be the villains of this show by the end of it. But I think Soul and the layers that Soul is going to bring to this show is something that I'm pretty ready for. I think it's unique, and I do really like the way he's portrayed in these first 2 episodes.
Yeah, I mean, Anthony Tiff, thank you for sending in that question. Yeah, it's sad that people are just dismissing it, right? And it is a little bit of a frustration for me as well. But when you hear someone like throw out woke, it doesn't have any meaning at this point. So just ignore it. That's how we operate. Like, are you telling me that the most appealing guy? I mean, in this show, Master Soul is just woke because he's talking. Like he hasn't done anything other than that, and he's had some incredible action so far. He's only proven that he's a cool Star Wars character and a great Jedi so far, from what we know. And underneath the performance so far, and we definitely do see that he's almost very halted. There are things that are like kind of crumbling and cracking thanks to this mystery really coming to the forefront here. Like, am I supposed to say like, oh man, that's woke? I'm like, no, I'm not. I'm not gonna say that because it's like I don't know what that means in this context anyhow. So yeah, I mean, best thing you can do is just watch the show, make your feedback and opinion known online however you want to, and don't demean anyone else for what they have, right? Especially if they have well-intentioned criticism. Because like we started off here with our review, there are things that like we're like a little bit hesitant on just from other past live action Star Wars and all that, and some of that comes from unfamiliarity, some of that comes from familiarity, right? So now we're just trying to juggle and see if this is stuff that is just to get all the mandates out of the way and then finally get the show really rolling by its third episode, or if these are things that we should be looking out for, right? So that's what we're going to come with feedback wise. But when we hear stuff about characters and not they haven't necessarily done anything significant yet, and we're already hearing stuff like that. It's like, what can you say, right? That's just they're already put into that position where they're gonna hate it. Let it be, right? Just show up with fans who want to have discussions, talk with them, and I think you'll have a good time watching the show because I think myself kind of keeping that away from what we keep here on our socials, keeping that away from my personal socials. I've enjoyed the lead up to Acolyte. I've enjoyed everything about this. It made my experience a lot easier for me than even Ahsoka was, right? And Ahsoka was already pre-established. But then once the socials reviews started coming in and people rightfully had some criticisms, it became a little bit of a hot ground by the end. I'm kind of happy now that I've ignored all of that, and I don't think it's going to necessarily become worse with Acolyte because I think it's already gone a lot of its initial like questions and initial like skepticism out of the way, and it's become at least a strong start for a show. So yeah, just keep your head up, watch Star Wars and enjoy it for what it is. And if you don't, you can always stop, right? No one's forcing you to put your eyes glued to the screen here or anything.
I think this is going to be a super frustrating week for the next, or the super frustrating next 7 weeks for all of us watching the
Yeah.
Acolyte. Whether you love watching it or whether you're watching it because it's Star Wars and you're like, it's all right, or you hate it, it's going to be a frustrating next 7 weeks. There's going to be a lot of voices out there who've never seen the show. There'll be a lot of voices out there who don't actually have real criticism, and unfortunately, that's going to be what we have to deal with. But hopefully, Star Wars Lads provides you all with a little bit of a space for discussion, real discussion about the Acolyte. We're not going to be incredibly positive if it doesn't warrant it. We're not going to be incredibly negative if it doesn't warrant it. We're going to be as unbiased as always on this channel, but I know it has been getting review bombed everywhere. So don't let those reviews really make have you make a judgment. Watch the show and then make the judgment. If you hate it, that's fine. I certainly didn't think it was amazing, but I thought it was good. Your In regards to your chat and the Truth of Bandock, I think Soul, he could know what happened and he sees his training of Osha. That was kind of like his redemption for a moment. He seemed very intent in this episode on moving on. He's trying to get May and the thoughts about May out of Osha's head. And I do think in a lot of lights, he's going to be kind of lying from a certain point of view. He'll be lying to Osha. So I do think that they're setting that up, and that's ultimately going to cause a divide here. I do think maybe we see Osha like in my head from this first couple episodes, we see Osha possibly become the new Sith acolyte after May isn't able to become who she's supposed to be. It's a very Sith thing. And by the way, the word Sith is never used in these first two episodes. We don't know if that guy, if he's referring to himself as an acolyte, he's referring to May as the acolyte. We don't know if he's Sith. We don't know if he's Dark Jedi. We don't know what he is. And so I'm glad that they still have that mystery out there because it's still we're kind of figuring out the mysteries of who this guy is with the Jedi, and I think that's a smart way to do it instead of just coming out and being like, "Yeah, there's the Sith Lord, and here he is." We're as Star Wars fans intrigued by, okay, how are they handling this? But going back to Soul, I do think there's going to be part of him that, from a certain point of view, he's lying to Osha. I think she might travel down that dark path ultimately, and then displace May, take over as the Sith acolyte, maybe kill or defeat May. I think they're setting that up personally, but he could have also, like you're saying, maybe as the youngest of the three, or maybe as one of the ones that wasn't directly involved with the events, maybe protecting Osha at the time, he could be one of the ones that was off somewhere and doesn't know the real truth behind it all. And that's why he's personally convinced himself that it's not really what he thought it was, that it's what he wants to believe. And so I think the mind games are going to be a big part of the show.
Yeah, no, I'm in full agreement. Like there are further twists. It's not just that like he was like just guilty about what happened and is over. But I think you can also look at some of his design. He doesn't look too young, or sorry, too old, right? He looks fairly young, and he's got scarring over his face, and his eye almost looked like it was very damaged and all that. And when you take the bearish vow, you're not just taking it because it's like, oh, I need to like take some time off from the Jedi. It's like a very specific thing of like, I feel like I need a disconnect from the life and the circumstances that I was in. I've made mistakes. I don't feel truly the Jedi I should be. And it's come to such a point that I've had to take this very, very extreme leap. Like the episode is like telling us like one of the Jedi is like he hasn't talked in 10 years, and Soul is like, he'll talk to me, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that also opens up a can of worms of like, why exactly would he need to, right? If this is something he's kind of closed himself off from. So I'm excited for that. It does feel like the reason why Soul isn't entirely feeling guilty is because his role in whatever happened on Brendock is not the same as what Torben went through. Torben seems like he kind of got himself in like a fight from whatever happened there. I think we've seen in previews too that he fights Kelnaka and he looks like he's possessed at some point. So whatever happened here before this fire, I think is already going to be enough of a complication for these Jedi. And we don't know what Indara's role is. We just know that she died in this episode, but she was one of the first targets for a reason. So I am very curious on what she did and why she was selected to be killed first, right? So I don't think it's because she has less power or anything. I think it's because she's one of the more martial focused ones and would be the first one that you kind of want to get out of the picture for May. So yeah, I mean there are like a lot of complicated layers here. And when we talk about truth in Star Wars, it's never clear. Like Obi-Wan, yes, I know it's because Lucas kind of changed his plans by episode 6, but he's once he said from a certain point of view, that's kind of how Star Wars history has been viewed since then, right? Like you can look at the events of the High Republic, you can look at the events of the Old Republic, all these future eras, like we have New Republic and all that. That those might be a little bit more concrete because we have these characters that are legacy, like from the movies and all that. But once we start going really, really back in the timeline, when it's people who haven't necessarily been alive for the main Skywalker saga to know, it can be kind of twisted and skewed based on the perspective. And since this is like a very dark side focused show, who's to say that this isn't almost like a retelling from someone in the Bay Knights who's like, oh yeah, like this is how things went here, and this is how May or Osha set us up for this path before Plagueis and Palpatine became next up. We don't know exactly what sort of dark side influence is going to be here, but it's going to be exciting regardless. So
Mhm.
I think guilt is going to be a very interesting word to really analyze per each episode.
Yeah, and there's a lot around Soul, I think, that possibly leads towards like his manipulation kind of these events as well. Like, off the top of my head, he is able to use a mind trick on that guy the guy that they say is really crazy and does things and says weird things to you in the prison cell. He's using a mind trick on him right away. He also, at the beginning, there's a reference to, oh, don't erase something from my mind like you guys can do, Jedi, and I feel like that might be tying into something maybe here in the future, um, where he kind of eased maybe some of the memories that Osha had, and we know that he says he saw May die, and he saw the fire started by May, and Osha says that a lot of things about perspective here that I think are going to be really interesting, and I do think we're going to have that kind of shift, right? If Kelnaka dies next episode, and then Soul either dies or has the big reveal in the fourth episode, I think we're setting it up to almost go back in time and re-explore basically everything that happened before the show from 5 to 6 or 7 on, like, and then meet back up with the main timeline. This show's going to jump around. It's going to have a lot of different perspective, and I think that's something that's pretty unique that I'm excited to see if it's done right. The writing has overall been fairly sharp outside of the exposition, in my opinion, and I think the pacing of the writing and the exposition have been the flaws, but the overall dialogue I think has been pretty decent. And so I'm looking forward to seeing what happens. I think Soul has a lot of layers to him. I think he will be something really different. But yeah, Torben's design, I think, leads you to kind of assume that something happened for the worst. And for those Star Wars fans, like you were mentioning, Senek, like the brash vow is a huge thing for people who know the High Republic and know obviously the Darth Vader comics. So that's a big name drop. It's not just something that they can throw in from extended canon is just like a term to use. It's a big deal to say that. So looking forward to tracking how that conflict plays out. But thank you so much, David, for sending in that super chat. Then we'll scroll back up here to the top for Colton Smith, who says, I didn't have super high expectations going in for the show, but it was pretty good. The lead carries the story a lot of a lot as twins, but it is interesting and has me interested in the season. One problem I had was that in the outdoor snow scene, there wasn't any breath effect added, which stood out to me. Love the usage of planets and aliens. I didn't notice that, but that's a good pull if you saw that for sure. Definitely something they missed. But I think I agree with you about the planets and aliens. This show, like the High Republic has so many alien species and some new ones as well. Not too sure about the guy who has like the long tongue come out and like attacks the guard. I wasn't sure about that design, especially didn't make that much sense why he would be in a cage where he could easily do that to the guard droid. Other than that one, I did like a lot of the new alien designs. I thought the way they fleshed out these cities and made it feel vibrant and lived in, that was something very OT that they've brought back into the prequel and the time before the prequels with the prequel iconography of the Jedi and all that. So very cool. I love Indara sitting in a bar, with all these beans and stuff too, like that. Just seeing the Jedi be a part of the world where it's not unique or weird or different. It's just they're in it. They're living in it. I thought was
Yeah.
very neat.
Yeah, and I mean, it is fair to point out like some things, right, that didn't happen as you expected, especially like this breath that I mean, I also didn't notice that, but at the same time, she does kind of have a bit of a bait and switch there because it is a vision first that she's chasing after the younger May before she almost like transitions back into her memories. and we don't even know if it's memories. It's just it looks like almost like a pure force vision, and something between them is linking them and keeping in touch and contacting them. Something about May is almost leaking out to Osha, and like subconsciously she's trying to like be connected, or she's almost like bleeding from the heart for her sister who she's thought she's dead. So we don't know if that was an intentional thing or not, but if it is, yeah, I mean, that is kind of ultimately what comes down to this with any sort of movie or show, right? There's going to be things that are not 100%. You can only hope that they're going to be as perfect as they can be, as immersive. But if that's the case, that's fine. Maybe they just weren't that cold. Maybe the snow is not really snow. I don't know. We'll see how it plays out here. Um, but yeah, no, I definitely agree about the alien stuff. I thought the alien worked in the sense that it looked like he was almost like ripping out his skull, and maybe that's just something unique to him. It didn't look very easy, to say the least. It looked like it was a little bit of a difficult thing for him to do, and then that Cyborg had to like shut down the droids in the ship. And I don't think that prison droid could do two things at once, right? So maybe it was just everything was caught off guard. I need to rewatch it again, obviously, but I don't know. I wasn't upset by that. I thought it was just almost like, wow, that's like some weird like body modification that you don't expect from his species, and maybe like he as he's ripping it out, and you assume that's not something that like can easily be picked up or people are aware of. But if all of his species like that, then I'll be like, all right, you should put binders on his head or something, even if it does look goofy. But yeah, no, I like the planet so far. I agree with that. I like the noodle bar that they're in. I wish Master Ndara was actually eating noodles. I felt like that would have been a little bit more of a natural transition for some of May's first lines. But yeah, no, I agree, Colton. There is a lot going on, and if you didn't have a lot of expectations, I think people are going to be pleasantly surprised. If you're like super excited for this, or like this is gonna be like High Republic Phase 4, I don't think you'll feel that after these first two, and I don't think it was ever meant to be because it is 100-year gap. So
Yeah.
sometimes just being willing to be open and see what comes out for these shows sometimes allows you to like really engage and see these extra details, like you mentioned.
Yeah, and that's where like, man, I just wish we had a little bit more time in this episode or one episode before this, something because there's so much to the world of the High Republic, right? There's so much to this time period between the High Republic and the Phantom Menace, and the fact that this is the end of the High Republic. Like, what does that mean? It feels like all that exposition was crammed into character exposition, and there's no world building. I think that's what I'm worried about is if this show does just stick to this narrative, this murder mystery only. A lot of what I was excited for about the show, how it builds out the world, how it builds where the Sith are at this time, how it builds where the High Republic is, how it builds how the Jedi have fallen, how we are getting closer to the prequels. A lot of that might be lost. So again, only 2 episodes, 6 more left. So not going to completely judge it, but I think the tone and the pace of these first 2 episodes lend me to believe that there's not going to be much world building around it, um, outside of like these are the Jedi, this is what's going on with them at the time, but what's going on with the Republic, right? Like, why are there droid pilots and droid security guards? What happened to the kind of small military that they had during the reign of the Nile? What happened to like a Jedi escorting these highly valuable prisoners, especially if one's a Jedi killer, whereas the Jedi escorting, these characters, all those types of things, like are the Jedi stretched thin? Is there something that has changed the relationship between the Jedi and the Republic? A lot of that stuff I think could have been maybe boring for this first episode, but at least interesting to build on the world, and then we could have kept going from there. But it just felt like that was missing a little for me too. And I'm not trying to like nitpick. I want to like the show. This was when they announced all those shows in 2020. This was my second most anticipated outside of Ahsoka. So because we'd already knew Obi-Wan was coming out, so I really want to love this show, and I like it so far. But I do think there are certain things like that with the pace and the structure that I'm a little concerned about still. But thanks for your comments, Colton. Back to Anthony says, I think that May is working for a Sith, maybe not a Sith master, but definitely a Sith apprentice. Yeah, I think that whole scene is interesting. She does. I did write down some of that too because I was really trying to track all this. I took more notes here than I even usually do, but she does refer to the quote unquote Sith as her master or the master, but she doesn't say Sith, and she doesn't. She might not know that he's not the master. That is something that they could have possibly pulled from Plagueis, where Plagueis gives Palpatine the okay to train Maul as if Maul thinks he is the actual Sith apprentice when indeed he actually never really is. And I that is my only tiny critique of Plagueis because I love the story so much. But that story makes it so Maul basically is never actually a Sith apprentice, not until like the last 10 minutes of attack of the Phantom Menace. So that's a weird like change for Maul in that book, but it is something that has precedent in Star Wars, right? So May could think she's the apprentice when she's really not. This is kind of a proving ground too, and I think that's kind of interesting. It's very ham-fisted the way it's said. Like that whole line, like, I really did not like the tag at the end of the first episode. The end of the second episode one was weird, but I guess I was kind of expecting it maybe a bit more. But that end of the first episode tag was very strange, and I went back and rewatched it a second time with subtitles to catch all the stuff that guy says. But it also it really makes no sense. Like it's completely out of context. You have no idea what he's talking about. There's no references to anything we've really seen in the past, and the only thing that I caught was that he says an acolyte can kill somebody without a weapon, and then the next episode we're kind of I guess supposed to have remembered that he said that because May says, "Well, I got to kill one of these four Jedi without a weapon because that's what the Master wants." So that was an interesting little thing. But anyway, that was my little tangent on the Sith. But I think he'll be related to the Sith. I'm still not convinced he's fully Sith, and in some ways, I almost feel like he's calling himself an acolyte. Like almost maybe May's another step down. Maybe he's like an acolyte. Maybe he's a Maul-esque figure. And then there's an apprentice, and then there's a master, and then May's way down here. May's like an assassin for them. I wouldn't mind that because I still really want to see Tenebris. But yeah, interesting the way they've set him up so far. And I feel like if we hadn't seen so much from the trailers or so many shots from him outside of these two episodes, it would be really a strange first look at this character.
Yeah, I agree that it is the only like negative that I can point out. Everything else might just settle for me once we, get some time to really see the episodes again and like really consider what is happening, why they're doing some things here, why they're not saving it for later and all that. But yeah, you know, uh, it is a very curious situation. It could be like the Plagueis novel with, like you're saying, Maul, not really the apprentice that we think he is in the Phantom Menace until like at the very end before like the duel even happens. So,
Yeah.
I'm not sure they're gonna do it like that. It would be interesting if this is a Sith apprentice who is being prepared to by his master and like any good Sith does, right? They eventually start taking the steps to usurp their master, to kill and strike them down. And for me, I almost want it to be as unique as possible. And I think if you kind of mirror what you're doing with Maul here, that might not be like something that people will be like, oh, okay, like that's cool or whatever. But it might be something that you've already seen. But if we do something where it's like this was the original lineage under Bane, through Jana and every other Sith afterwards, but then it got usurped by this other branch of the Bayites or something. Like if there are like a little bit more split forks here that we didn't know about, like if this was supposed to be the original, but then the Bayonite philosophy was followed by somebody else who was just like, no, you're a pretender, right? You were
Hmm.
never really the apprentice. You never really killed the master. That'd be super interesting to me because if there's anything that we know about Sith, they really don't like to die. They'll do anything possible not to die. If they are dead, they're going to be haunting still. So it'd be very interesting, I think, if they went for that angle. I just don't see this character, the master, being the Sith master. But this, whoever it is, if it is an apprentice, if it's like a precursor to the Knights of Ren, whoever it may be, they clearly are, allowing May to have quite a reach with what her activities are because she's talking to Kamir. She's talking to this like smuggler type person who knows the Sith code to a degree, who's supplying poison, has been tracking down Jedi. It's like there's a network here too. So I wouldn't be surprised if they have a hand in that as well. It's just now they're kind of almost like testing May to see like how are you going to use that? Are you going to play it safe? Like there's a big point of like, are you going to poison Master Torben, or are you going to kill Master Torben to please the Master? Which one is better, right? And I thought that was the one line from Kamir that could really be excavated here in the upcoming episodes. Maybe give a hint of if he's got an actual identity outside of just being like this gun runner, like he says for the Huts. But yeah, I mean, we don't know exactly who this master is, if they're even Sith, if they're like witches even or something. We really
Yeah.
don't know yet. But if they are Sith, I just don't see them as the master yet. They'd have to be at best the apprentice.
And no references to those witches at all, which were like
Yeah.
the focal point of the villain side in that first original teaser, right? So like
Yeah.
in a lot of weird ways, we've seen very much so far more than I thought we would have. I thought we would have mostly only seen what happened in the first 2 or 3 episodes. Maybe the third episode is the point where we see it. I do think, that's going to be the episode where all the Jedi end up on the Force planet Kofar, and you're going to see Kelnaka there. There's going to be a lot that happens in that third episode, but and I think that the episode times were released. I believe the third episode was closer to the length of the first one than the second one, and the fourth episode is the short one. So there should be quite a bit that happens in this third episode. But yeah, no references to those witches at all. And they really made us think that those were going to be like the main villains in the show. Also, just another little side note that was just like in that whole tag on the first episode, that was just kind of a little eye rolly too. Was like, he turns on why turn on your your lightsaber just randomly there? Like he's like giving a whole monologue, and then he's just like, yeah, just so you forget, in case you forgot. I am the guy with the red lightsaber. You're working for me. You're trying to get one of these. I have one. It's just a little show of power, but I feel like a close up of his face or something would have done, like, something there would have made it at least a little bit more like intriguing, or like, who is this? I don't know. That was a weird scene for sure. Back to Anthony, who says, "Do you think the twins could have a dyad?" That was something I definitely thought of, especially because I think the Acolyte is coming out of a lot of different places. We know that Leslie Headland has a strong connection to Ryan Johnson. We know she said she appreciated a lot of what he did in The Last Jedi. And for all intents and purposes, the dyad wasn't necessarily named or created in The Last Jedi, but it was basically started in The Last Jedi. So that's something interesting she could pull. I think there are going to be that different perspectives like Ryan Johnson did with The Last Jedi. I think there's going to be that different perspective. And then so maybe some type of reference to a dyad or an early dyad, possibly. But I don't think we're going to go that far because it would change a lot of the lore. It would break a lot of the lore, and not necessarily break, but it would make it less impactful. Like, like the one thing the sequels did have that was very impactful was this dyad was so powerful between Kylo Ren and Rey that it was able to bring back Palpatine from the dead. He is born again in a decaying body. His body completely comes back to life after 30 years of trying to figure out how to transfer his essence into a body. He'd basically given up. He's like, I'm going to transfer my essence into somebody else now and just basically be kind of in control of their body. And now that dyad is so powerful, he's able to fully come back to life. I feel like if you just add another one, like it should be something so rare it only happens once every 1,000 years. Or
It is a weird thing, right? Because we've seen visions so far. We haven't really seen anything that suggests that, like, they don't see their surroundings, they're interacting, they're aware yet. It is very one-sided. It is OSHA so far, and I think the dyad has to, even if it's activated by one person or the other, you both have to almost be, like, on the call together, right? I don't really think that's what we're seeing here. I think a better comparison would just be a Force vision in the cave like Luke saw, but it's happening when Osha's kinda knocked out, right? Like a dream of sorts. I don't, I don't wanna say dyad. I agree. I think dyad is just it's a power, right? It's not necessarily just a bridge, and I'm sure there are ways to bridge people's minds with the Force and do things with, their abilities that isn't necessarily done consciously, but I wouldn't say diet. I think a diet is just it's too recent anyways for us to be like, "Oh, here's May and Osha," but I could definitely see it being something related to her family, to her parents, right? I think the implication is that they were part of this witch tribe or something,
Yeah,
and maybe their abilities and the magic involved is what we're kinda seeing here, some
yeah,
remnants of what kinda, like, built them up, built up their sibling connection and all that. Like it's always great to say, even in real life, like, oh, like siblings can sometimes like read each other's minds, especially twins. But like when witches also do something and a little extra and add like another like layer of intrigue of like, yeah, I didn't even know what's happening with these kids, but there's just something special about them since they're born at the same time. All right. So, and the fact that they're 8 when they're separated, when the fire happens and all that, we don't know what sort of training OSHA had and what May had before they were even taken in by the Jedi and taken in by this master, right? So, that's a whole 3rd element that's outside of our traditional force powers of darksiders and lightsiders.
yeah, and that's an interesting point too. And I do think, absolutely think there's connection between these girls and the witches. I think the witches might not even be in this show until the flashback. You know, they might be the ones that the Jedi killed, and then they by killing them, these girls were still there. You know, we obviously it's going to be tied to that. Like I feel like even though I'm worried we're picking all of the exact plot points out in this show already, um, there's going to be a connection to the fact that May doesn't kill the bartender because of his daughter or his kid, right? There's going to be that type of connection. I feel like that's going to be the thing where like maybe May and, May and Osha's parents' mother was an enemy to the Jedi, and they killed their parents. Like, they killed them because they were an enemy to the Jedi, and from a certain point of view, they were doing what was right. From the opposite point of view, you kill their parents, and now, we want revenge. And that is something we've seen a lot in the High Republic, right? The Jedi being kind of villains from a different point of view to the Nile, to the Path, to even in recently in the Living Force book that we read about the Jedi Council right before the Phantom Menace. There is that thing where like the Jedi did something, it had repercussions, and ultimately they've created a new enemy for themselves. And I think that's something that always is a conversation really about, good versus evil and heroes and villains and how do especially a government regulated heroes, how do they operate and what's when's it time for restraint and when's time for action. That's going to be part of this show. And I do think there's definitely something there. But this mother Anisea, I mean, she might just actually be their mom.
Yeah.
I think that could get revealed because we are going to go back. We're for sure going to go back. And David said that a little later on. It might be the next chat where he says I think part of the point is not to show the flashback right away to reinforce what each character subjectively believes happened became the truth. The objective truth of the fire is irrelevant this many years out. I don't know if it's going to be irrelevant. I think, but I do think we are going to eventually see all the points of view of something and then ultimately kind of see what happened. And I didn't mean I wanted to see the entire scene when I said that at the beginning about why didn't they show us the fire or some glimpse of it. I meant kind of like you have this kid maybe standing in front of a fire, seeing this horror, right? And then you cut to black, and then it says 10 years later, or whatever, 15 years later. That's another little tease. Like it's something that with an image, you show us something instead of having to say it. And then as the characters say it later, you as an audience member are like, oh, that's what that fire was. And that's who we were seeing, right? That those types of little connections. It could be 2 minutes, it can be 1 minute, it could be 30 seconds long, but I just think those visual cues. Somebody who lives and dies by the rule that, you're taught in film school, which is show don't tell, and it drives me insane when everything is told. So I just mean we don't have to see the whole thing. I think it is fun to unravel the mystery, but just one little shot or the little girl version of Osha or May, and their eyes, you in their eyes, you see flames, something, anything that just kind of like alleviates a bit of just having to sit down and be like, yeah, 10 years ago this happened, and then I did this, and we were there, and each one of us were there, and then she became a Jedi, and then I trained her, and it was just kind of this whole dump, and I don't really love that as personally, but that is my preference. Everybody might feel differently. Back to Colton again. Yeah, just kind of said what I just said. I was waiting for flashbacks. They were teased every other second. Yeah, and we're gonna get them eventually, I think. Anthony says, personally, I like pausing the show, then process it, and then unpause it. And then Anthony says, I get you, man. Personally, I feel I like fast pacing because many have compared it to a video game, as many video games are fast paced, such as some COD games, God of War 1 through 3, and some parts of Halo. Hey, and that's completely fair. I don't mind the fast pacing. It's just the like brevity of the show, removing it doesn't feel like it's fast paced in terms of like the excitement is there, yes, but it feels like it's fast paced in order to sacrifice things that I feel like should be there, like the world building, like some shots that just like 5-second shots, 10-second shots, 15-second shots that explain things through image and not through voice. That's kind of what I'm just saying. And that's my preference. Again, that's personally my preference. Everybody else can feel completely different. So that's very fair. Uh,
Yeah, yeah, and
comment on that?
sorry, I just wanna mention also that, like, we don't know the full lengths. There has been some sort of leaked ones, and it does seem like they're gonna be around this length, so maybe we do really get the mystery, like, solved by the 4th episode, and now
Mm,
everything is, like, dealing with the repercussions, dealing with the next steps, making right or, making not right in the case of this dark-sided coded journey that May has, right? So, I don't know. I'm giving the positive, thoughts and benefit of the doubt towards Leslie
Devil's
just
advocate.
because she's handled Russian Doll, right? She's
Right.
done 2 seasons of that. I know it's a lower budget. She doesn't have to think about all, like, Star Wars isms and, locations and set design, all that. I agree. Like, that stuff is a lot more of a big step up from your average TV show showrunner. But I think that she has a grasp on what she wants, and that she's just dealing with the realities of what Disney is asking her to do, especially since this is the first season of, like, a very unproven material, an unproven era, and we know
Right.
Disney has not really taken those chances, other than, like, Mandalorian, which was still very great because it's like, "Oh, Boba Fett but silver," right? That's all you really need to know for your enjoyment. So
Right.
yeah, we'll see, and the thing that they've been talking about a lot too is that they're looking to see if they can get a 2nd season.
Right.
Maybe change the length of it, maybe it becomes a little bit more focused on, like, the characters and what they're doing, what they're setting up for the galaxy, the stakes of the Jedi, the stakes of these Darksiders, the stakes of these witches. Right now, it's just that the mystery is, like, happening so real time to them, eh, it does feel a little discombobulated at times. But if these episodes are longer, maybe the last batch are a little longer, and we aren't throwing in new twists every 5 minutes, then, maybe it will sit better. I don't know. Sometimes these shows are just better when you watch them again.
Yeah, that's fair. And I do think those types of mysteries, when you're trying to unfold it, like when we know a show's a mystery, you're trying to unfold it in your head before it happens, right? That's just like part of the formula. So it's not a way in which like expectations overrule reality. Because I think both of us still watch things even if we have hopes of what will happen, or ideas for what will happen, and we are very much so accepting and never really let those predictions influence what actually happens. To me, I honestly kind of try to forget everything I predicted after the video and then
Yeah.
just watch the show, right? Because we have to critique what's there. Um, but when you're doing a murder mystery, when you're doing that type of thing, there's that invitation to predict, that invitation to guess what's going to happen next. And I do think there are a lot of those elements here that do make me think even harder about, well, what happened here, what's the reference to this, how does it connect to this, and let's just exist in the show. Let's just go with the show right off the bat, right? I think it's very fair to do when you're, just starting something new. But I still would prefer to live and breathe in this world, to truly exist in this world, considering this is a time period we'd never really seen. Like even our earliest point in Legends after the fall of Bane is like 67, 70, 80 BBY. This is 132 BBY. This is like the High Republic, a time untouched. And I just want to see more about the world as well. Jeffrey Miller says, "Good evening. Good evening, Jeffrey. Glad you're joining us." Okay, we talked about yours, David. There, K-pop Time says, I really enjoyed it. I think it's well written so far. Oh yeah, the tags at the end are out of place. Yeah, there, definitely
Yeah.
agree with you there. And then Anthony says, May's accomplice seems to know the Sith code. Could this be a hint at the beginning of the Sith worshippers, such as the Sith Eternal and the Acolytes of Beyond? That's definitely an interesting thought. Is there a reason okay, that's a different question, so I'll answer that after. Interesting thought. I think the fact that this helmet looks like Kylo Ren, I think, is also very interesting. I talked about that a little bit in my video, which is still relevant, by the way, because there's 6 more episodes. If you want to check it out, and you had it, where I tried to not necessarily predict characters that be in the show, but say these characters can show up in the show. And we talk about how the Knights of Ren don't come into existence until right around the end of the Battle of Endor, or around right before the Battle of Endor. But in a way, they could be inspired by this type of character because the helmet is so similar, right? And a lot of these other acolytes could be, right? I mean, obviously, the Acolyte of the Beyond have the actual name of the show in there, the whole idea of an acolyte, the way he references an acolyte as being somebody really important almost. You feel like if he was hyping up the Sith, right, he would say something about Sith, right? Or he would say a Sith acolyte or some, I don't know. There was an odd like absence of the word
Yeah.
Sith in this episode that made me second guess, are there even going to be Sith in this show? And I think that was there. So Sith Eternal. I don't know necessarily about Sith Eternal. I would love more lore about Sith Eternal, but it does seem like something that's kind of almost created around Palpatine, like something he founded, something that's very, very much so around him. And if it's not, I think it would be more centered around catering to the Sith Master. Then there's also that whole idea of like, how did the Sith gather these people over time without being public? It does make a bit more sense for Palpatine to gather these worshippers while he's emperor, while it's a little more public, his figure out there rather than trying to stay hidden. So there's that. But I would love some more Sith Eternal lore. Not sure about that. But Acolytes of the Beyond is an interesting shout, and I think something that possibly has some credence in this type of show. But I that might just be too many factions to get to in such a short amount of time.
Yeah. There's there's a lot that the show is throwing at us, so to then start connecting almost everything immediately to stuff we already know about, I think would be a little too much. Because then there becomes a question of like, okay, you've thrown out all these elements, all these characters, and then you're suddenly shrinking the galaxy, making everything way too connected when this should be a new jumping off point for so many new Star Wars fans, people who have only been reading the High Republic and are looking to see if there are any references that they would be familiar with. If you're suddenly saying like, "Oh yeah, here's something that is like in a source book that is tied to the Rise of Skywalker," it's like, okay, that's that's not really like what I'd want to have this Leslie Headland story to be really focused on, right? This is her story, her characters. It just happened to line up really nicely with stuff that was already happening here with the High Republic, and then they found some nice level ground on improving that. So, yeah, I again, I'm also with Liam. That design on that helmet, just it gets me a little too, like, curious of, like, okay, this is something that eventually is then taken on by the Wrens, right? And the Knights of Ren, if you read the comics and all that, they're marauders. They're just, like, for hire, they're whatever, and the Ren himself that we see in the comics is not the first one, so we have no idea how this group was like before, if it was more of a philosophy, break something else. I don't know, but, I'd go for something like that because it is relatively like, not bureaucratic in the same way the Sith Eternal is, where your life is organized from the start, and there's people devoted to the Sith forces,
Yeah.
devoted to the construction of all these Star Destroyers and all that. I think that's when it gets a little too much, but,
Mhm.
it's interesting to think about, like, the other dark side or dark side adjacent cultures and force connections that we've seen through all these different types of Star Wars mediums and media. So, yeah, no, it's a fair shout. I personally wouldn't want us to immediately be like, well, that is a connection that has already been made to, you know, further boost up the sequels. Like, it's not necessary 100 years before the prequels.
Yeah, the Sith Eternal are kind of presented in the Rise of Skywalker almost like the Star Wars versions of Death Eaters,
Yeah.
like these people who are just there to hype up Palpatine. They're like, yeah, yeah, let's join this big ceremony we've been waiting 30 years for him to finally accomplish. In the meantime, we'll help him build his Star Destroyers. There's a lot to work on with Sith Eternal that will make them like I think it's an interesting concept, but there's a lot there to build on even more. But I think it would be cool to kind of have it stem from Bane, like this, or maybe post Bane, because that doesn't seem like something Bane would agree with. But maybe post Bane, right? Like maybe a Xana thing or a Cognis thing, if you want to keep Cognis post Xana, like this idea of just accumulating allies, right? Obviously, the circle around a Sith, knowing somebody is a Sith, that needs to be small, and that's where something that I'm not convinced Sith Eternal is part of pre-Palpatine Sith, because it is, obviously a very big circle of people who know Palpatine's a Sith Lord. But if if it was just a 1,000-year accumulation of allies, I think that could be also something that's kind of interesting as well. And like in the nature of the Sith, like kind of keeping them protective, but also isolated, and they can never leave Exegol. They're just stuck there. Like by swearing yourself to the Sith, you're stuck there forever. And it's something only the Sith masters know about is the fortress on Exegol. Excuse me. That would be, I think, something really interesting that we could possibly see in the future. But I don't know if Acolyte is the place for that. K-pop Time says, love how this is a new jumping on point for Star Wars. I agree. It's always nice to have something that's kind of fresh. I think every time we do something that is different, it's bold. It gives people a chance to join. It also can turn off your dedicated audience because they might be so invested in the world. So there's a fine line to it. But I personally, as somebody who's heavily invested in Star Wars, do like when every year or two they do give us a show or something that's fresh, that's new. As much as I like season twos, it is nice to get a brand new thing in a brand new time period.
And the only thing I can add to that is that we need it. I think the Mandoverse definitely needs to have, like, a little bit of a break too, right? We know we have Skeleton Crew, that's gonna be almost like a refresh, um, but, Filoni and Favreau, I would say, have been a little stretched here. Acolyte, even if it is ultimately average or something, there is a story team, a writers group behind it in the same way that Andor is, so I can assume if a season 2 is coming out, it will be fresh, be interesting, and it'll be at its step up. It'll take a lot of criticism and be able to implement it because it's not just 1 or 2 guys that are focused on 8 scripts and also show and that's a difficult thing to do. And I'm really hoping personally that this is gonna be a great show because I want a new era to just jump into, and if I'm just bored of the High Republic, I'll be like, "Yeah, you wanna go specifically to the Acolyte verse and see things that are happening that are leading us into the prequels," which the High Republic's not necessarily focused on here. It's doing some things here and there in the books, but not the same way, so, yeah, I'm always open for new, right? And if it works out, then I'd like to see another season or 2 more, and then we can go to another new thing. And I hope the success of this, if it does eventually become a pretty strong success, does also have benefits for the other Star Wars live action and animations, shows, and movies and everything. And shows like, okay, this is working here. Maybe we can bring it over here and improve the product that we've got coming out here and the story that we've been developing here. Especially since Metaverse is playing with a lot more traditionally famous characters. I want them to be as good as possible.
Yeah, definitely. So Colton says, I wish they'd shown the Jedi Council in passing, felt like they were missing. I agree, Colton. I really want to see the Jedi Council. I'm also a little confused if Vernestra is on the council or not. I would assume she is, right? She's over 100 years old.
Yeah,
I
she
feel like
kinda
she's
has to
got to
be.
be. But she says she's convening a small council at the end of this episode, which is also interesting. And I guess it adds layers to the bureaucracy of maybe the Jedi starting to happen at this point. But yeah, I wish we saw the council. I think we'll see him at some point. Like if Master Soul is going kind of rogue here or on his own mission, doing his own thing, we know Vernestra goes into the field at some point because we've seen the little spot with the light whip. So we know she's going to have some action at some point. She's not just going to be like the person that he's talking to connect to back to Coruscant. Do love how many times we see Coruscant though. That's pretty great. And I think at some point we're going to have to get the council or at least Yoda. Like I would be shocked if Yoda's not in the show at some point. That's the one character from that video. I'm predicting the characters. Like I would absolutely be shocked if Yoda's not here or at very least a name drop, but he's got to show up at some point. Uh, yeah.
Yeah,
Anthony says correct. He learned English. That was Ling Jung Jai learned English in the show. Interesting. Burry is awesome. Yeah, Burry is very awesome. I kind of want Burry in the show too. Like, like it is a little ominous for Burry. Maybe not as much so with Arkoff because Arkoff's older, but kind of ominous for
yeah,
Burry that he's not in this show or we haven't heard him referenced when we know Wookiees live to be 200, 300 plus years old. So hopefully we
yeah.
see him at
I'd
some
love
point.
to see almost like a Predator-like dap between Buryaga and Kelnaka. We have, what's the other one from The Edge of Balance? Is it Actor?
Arkoff.
Is it Arkoff, right? So,
Yeah.
if we have, like, just 3 Wookiee Jedis just, like, chilling, that would be so awesome because it's just something that you'd imagine, like, in, like, your MMO playthrough, not in a Star Wars show or not even like
Yeah.
a Star Wars book sometimes because it does feel like it's hard to write for Wookiees, but just seeing them, like, oh man, I would love that.
Yeah, I would too. It would be awesome if Kelnaka does die, that like the other Wookiee Jedi are like, nah, like this can't happen. We got to come here and help out because nobody can kill a Wookiee Jedi. There's too few of us out there. That'd be really cool. I want to see Buryaga. Like I want to see like Jedi Master Buryaga. I think that would be really cool. K-pop Times says, same. I want him to survive so bad. I think you're talking about Kelnaka from our conversation earlier. And then says maybe even Soul will die. I think it's a strong
Yeah,
possibility Soul dies. Like if not, my prediction last week when we were talking on our stream was that he dies at the end of the show. I still think that's very possible, but I also think now it's possible that he dies in the middle of the show, and then a lot of the second half of the show is flashbacks or are that's kind of like trudging through maybe almost an episode of the event from each person's perspective. That would be 4 episodes, right? Or skip one of the perspectives or show two in the same episode, but like you know a retelling from multiple perspectives. I think that would be an interesting take. Now it is a TV show, and part of the TV show is like you want people to watch every week. And if you redo the same thing 3 times, that might not necessarily go over well with audiences who are like, "Oh my god, we're doing this again." So I think it would be interesting. It would be interesting on a binge. I don't know if it would work necessarily in weekly release TV, but I could see them doing that. And if that was the case, then I could see Soul dying and then making that transition to Jackie and Osha earlier in the show than we initially thought. But I really liked Daphne Keene as Jackie. Like that was one of my big highlights for me in the show was Jackie and Yord. I wasn't sure about Yord in the first like 10 minutes of episode 1, but by the end I thought, okay, I like this dynamic and these people feel like the Jedi of the prequels to me. Like I think it worked. I like those two characters a lot.
yeah, it feel very much like the young adult novels of the High Republic characters interacting with the adults of the adult novels, or like the ones in between who are just been promoted, right? Like Yord is like,
Yeah.
it's only been 2 years since I've been promoted to Jedi Knight, and Jackie's kind of like, okay, Yord, put on your uniform, like don't be acting too much here, and like his plan is like, "I'm just you guys put everything around here, let's layer and construct this way of capturing Kamir, and then we go in and I'll be the one to confront him. She's like, "No, we'll send the person who looks like our target here that our target would recognize and have her use her comm to record and keep in track and be able to then take that perimeter." And it's like, yeah, that's such a better idea, right? Being a Jedi Knight doesn't necessarily mean that you're better in every way. You just might be older, right? So,
Right.
and I'm not to say like Yord is incompetent. I think he's shown like fairly sound decision making, but
Yeah.
he's also a little too full of himself, which is a big flaw of a lot of frequent Jedi. And I
Yeah.
maybe after the High Republic, after things have become a little bit more battle oriented and all that, maybe that is something that a lot of Jedi are facing, and then it kind of goes away as they become a little bit more like traditional, very like stern Jedi once more by the prequels, and then the Clone Wars rises up, and then you're like, oh, okay, well, we're back to this, and now we have no option because it's the whole galaxy at war. So, yeah, maybe Yord is like a precursor in that sense.
And like he to me seems like the combination of Obi-Wan and Mace Windu, right? Like he's
Yeah,
got the rule following of Obi-Wan, but he's got the like I'm better than you swagger of I'm a Jedi Knight, get out of my way, like Mace Windu. So it's kind of an interesting and like at first in episode 1 I wasn't sure about the writing around him. I was like, "Oh man, don't do the like elevated writing because these are Jedi, right? Like I don't want to
yeah,
hear this dialogue that's so like grandiose and like make them feel like real people." But then you start to realize, okay, that's just him. That's just who he
yeah.
is.
That's just who he is.
And I think that's when it starts to work a lot better for me with Yord because he does walk in on that prison ship or no on the Nemoidian ship. By the way, Nemoidians looked amazing,
Yeah,
so good, such a great evolution of the animatronics for those characters. But when he walks onto the Nemoidian ship and he goes, "I am Yord, Jedi Knight." And it's like, man, this guy thinks so high of himself. Like yeah, I think he's gonna bite it too, maybe, like, I don't know, he could get
yeah.
himself in
He
trouble.
he
Or he's
definitely looks like someone who will die.
yeah, they're setting you up to be like, this guy's kind of, punchable. But definitely enjoyed the dynamic there. Colton says Carrie Ann Moss's death surprised me. Yeah, we didn't really even talk about that much, but that being the preview from the Phantom Menace, it's the first scene in the entire show. And basically, we realized, yeah, they just cut off her death part from the preview of the Phantom Menace. They showed basically everything else. But yeah, it did surprise me too, especially because we had talked about it. Somebody had brought this up in one of our past streams, and like, you think all these characters die in the first episode or two? We're like, no, you can't have these big actors and not do it. But I think they're going to come back for more flashbacks. These characters,
Yeah.
Carrie Ann Moss will be in more of the show, but it is a surprise to have killed her off with basically no lines. She barely had a couple in the very first episode, but definitely a cool little twist. Like I think that got me kind of awake, like I'm sitting there watching the show and you're like, okay, how is this going to go? I'm taking my notes and then I'm like, whoa, okay, this is the direction we're going. Definitely a nice little twist there to get things rolling.
Yeah. And I would also say, like, you know, Carrie Ann Moss, she's been in very dramatic roles recently. So for her to go back to this Matrix-esque persona that she's had, you expect her to survive because she has been the badass. She's been the one who's, been able to handle business. But she doesn't die because she's outmatched my bae. She dies like any other true Jedi would. She's protecting someone, she's protecting life, and she there is a little bit of deception with how many knives May actually still has, obviously, and she stops the blade from the barkeep. Unfortunately, yeah, we see that immediately as she's turned her eyes away, she doesn't have time to react and, like, stop it, and we don't even know how powerful she really is. She might be one of those Jedi, as we've seen in, like, the old EU, who's got abilities that are a lot more focused on the martial aspects of the Force, but they might not be so great at telekinesis and all that. Like, even when she was saving that girl from falling off the second floor, I almost thought, like, that took a little more time than I would expect from a Jedi who's, like, master and all that. So,
Hmm.
it could be a case of we just don't know, and we won't get the chance on seeing how expanded her abilities are. But again, whatever happened there, 16 years ago, that could have affected her too. She was like, "Oh, man, it's you." Like, I can't like, she wasn't, like, beating herself up over it, but she's like, "Oh, man, it's this is not a good sign, things are going bad, and whatever happens in the flashback, I think that could be, like, an indicator of, like, something where she hasn't really done much, but she was just around and kinda abetting the situation that breaks out with the witches, or she did something super bad and she's like, "We have to just clean up," right? And then he
Yeah,
comes in later. That's why May is like, "Well, you try to clean up stuff, you try to hide stuff, that's why I wanna get rid of you first, or that's why
right.
I asked her to get out for that." So, yeah, I mean, I think how these Jedi die are gonna be really important to what the flashback ultimately pans out, what their younger self had done, 2 decades ago, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, and, Torben being at peace by basically accepting his fate too, like, there's each thing is going to play into their personalities and how we ultimately see that situation, so, I think it's set up to be a really cool twist there. I lost my spot on the questions here, but surprisingly, it is already an hour and 23 minutes into our stream, so, we said we'd go about an hour and a half. We can extend it just a little bit. There's so many questions, but we're not going to go a full 2 hours tonight. But hopefully, you guys have all these same questions and this enthusiasm for the next stream when we'll be back again, probably around 7 p.m. Pacific, 10 p.m. Eastern for next week because there's only one episode now for the remainder of the week. So we'll try to keep that time consistent. There being two episodes, it was a little less certain when we were going to go live, but thanks for joining, everybody. And we will continue right now with the next question. Once I find where I was, I believe it was Mr. Spock123 said, I love the show. Barash Vow mention was awesome. When they said Torben, I thought buckets of blood for a second. I really love how fast the show is moving. I'm really interested in what the four Jedi did. Yeah, me too. I think it's interesting to choose a name that's the exact same. It's a different spelling, but it's the exact same as another notable Jedi Master from the High Republic. Um, I was kind of disappointed when they said Torben and it wasn't Buckets of Blood, but yeah, I think great reference to the Brash Vow. Like I think that's something really cool. It obviously seems like something that's very prominent for High Republic Jedi. We've seen it a lot of are mentioned a lot in the High Republic, and we've started to see where the origins are, and we'll continue to see it, I guess, when Charles Soule continues his next miniseries for the Blade. But yeah, I love references to that, and I love references to hopefully get a Portal Angle reference as well. That would be pretty cool. But
Yeah,
yeah, great nods to some High Republic stuff in these first two episodes.
and clearly, this Master Torben character was just a long line of adopted children of buckets of blood, right? Like, they all found his name, the legend that he is. Clearly, they all are involved with making healing the Jedi, right? But, yeah, I don't know, it is pretty curious, right? Like, why it was so close, and maybe, like, the story group was like, "Hey, Leslie, that's, like, basically a character that's pretty prominent in these young adult, or the Young High Republic adventure comics and the middle grade books," and she was like, "Okay, that's cool, but I want my character to be this," or maybe there is a little bit more significance, right? We don't know. I'm gonna go with the former just because it's just there has been coincidences before, so,
Yeah.
yeah, we'll see how it goes.
Anthony Tiff says, yeah, that's right. Yeah, Anthony says, "Oh yeah, I thought Buckets of Blood was Torben." Yeah, definitely. Star Wars guy says, "I haven't finished yet, but I love Master Soul. We love Master Soul too." Anthony says, "I don't really care if people dislike it, but I hate when people come after me for liking something." Definitely. That's kind of the point of our channel.
Yeah.
You can hate it if you want, and you can love it if you want. And this is the place for you to do both. We're not going to tell you to dislike it if we dislike something. We're going to be glad you enjoyed it. If you hate something, we're not going to tell you to not hate it. We might give you our perspective on why we don't, but we're not going to tell you to not hate it. Your feelings are your feelings. All film is subjective. All TV is subjective. There are objective flaws in things, but your enjoyment is a subjective thing. You can love something, and it can technically be awful, but you can love it still.
Yeah,
So,
no, I mean,
and vice
and
versa.
it's such a big issue now with how fandom engagement is, right? There aren't people who have good meaning for what their criticisms are, right? I get that. That's just how they're entrenched. That's what they're gonna be. You can try to convince them, but honestly, at this point, you're only hurting yourself. But before an episode is able to be seen, and you're already seeing on like a Rotten Tomatoes or something, it's in
Yeah.
the 20s and 30%. How can you take that seriously, right? If anything, looking at that would just make you upset, right? And maybe make you be like, "Oh my god, all the" it's just a way that they know the cycle continues because you're gonna start complaining about it or note it online. Someone else will react and be like, "Oh, look, that's just validating that these people are getting upset that we don't like this Star Wars," whatever. It's just a culture war. It's annoying. It is what it is. But on this channel, if you don't like it and you've been genuinely trying to engage with the material, give it a chance, that's fine, right? If you're insulting people, God, no, like, you're not gonna be on this channel, we'll kick you off of here. That's just how it is, right? And, if you're causing distress to other people, that's not cool either. But if you're saying, like, "You know what? I don't like this," or "I don't agree with you, here's my reasons why," that's what Star Wars Labs is for, man. That if we wanted to, and we've talked about it in videos and streams for years now, if we wanted to, we could go more of that baity, rage bait way for this channel and be, like, 5 times bigger at this point. But that's an easy way. It's like what they say about the dark side with Yoda, right? The dark side is easy, quicker. It's not stronger, right? On our channel, we know we haven't grown necessarily because we're playing a game of numbers and all this and that. We're just saying we wanna talk about Star Wars and create a space for you guys. If we agree with you, awesome. If we don't, I'm glad that we at least both get to share our opinions. That's the only way it should be on this channel, and that's how it'll always be.
Colton says I was confused by how May was presented as a masked assassin, but then just walked up to the Jedi to confront them with no attempt to be stealthy. I'm unsure which one you're meaning in that. Is that are you talking about Master Torben? Or are you talking about like she was surprised by the Jedi? She didn't attack them, if you know what I mean. Or are you talking about with her mask when she like walks up to him and is like, I'm challenging you. If that's the case, I feel like
Yeah,
what they're
cool.
alluding to is that the Sith is he's like giving her basically like you know how when you play a video game and it's like you can complete the objective or you get more points if you complete these other two optional objectives while you complete the objective. I think it feels like the Sith's almost doing that. Like, yeah, you not only have to kill this Jedi, but you have to kill them with no weapon, or you have to kill this one by challenging them directly right in front of them. Um, it, that is, I think, something that they're trying to do, and also the Sith kind of gives that speech, right? That out of place speech in that last episode. There's something about confronting Jedi, challenging them head on, and breaking their spirit is kind of what the Sith realize over
The
the years
dream
that
they're
they need to
in, yeah.
do. It's not just killing the Jedi. There will be more Jedi if they just kill them, but they have to break them, and that's I think what the whole point is I'm challenging one on one, and I'm going to beat you.
Yeah, and to add to that, she's almost doing it in, like, a very formal and stiff way because it doesn't seem like she's 100% working in line with what her master is telling her, right? If she was, Kimir would not be the smuggler guy who's making the potion, the poison, right? He would not be involved in this, right? She was not told like, "Hey, go poison Master Torment." She was told, "Hey, go kill him." But the problem is his bearish vow, the amount of force concentration that he has going on is not allowing for her to make use of her traditional skill set, of her knives, of her martial abilities, right? So she even makes that note to Kimura, like, "Don't tell him about this," right? Like, this is not something that she wants to admit, and then when she sees the barkeep's child, right, and the way she's using children, right, she has a soft spot too, so there's a little bit of, like, is she trying to do everything her master's saying and then struggling with some of those elements? Or is she finding that some of the things that he's telling her aren't lining up maybe with what she's expecting from these so-called enemies, right? We don't
Yeah.
know how much she's being manipulated either, too. The only thing we've gotten so far is that she sees Osha, she goes by the childhood nickname, she's like, "Oshi?" And then she runs off and all that, right? So, there is a little bit of a softness to her too, right? Obviously, she's a murderer, but there's some very interesting things about, like, the code of conduct that she's kinda skimming around, the instructions that she's been told that she's finding some difficulties with.
Yeah, definitely. And I think again, that's another perspective thing too. It's how we're seeing the show, right? It'll be interesting to see which perspective the show actually attaches itself to when things start really going down. But Finn K says if the biggest complaint is missed breath effect, then I think it's a good start. Hey, that's fair.
Yeah.
And I think it is a better start for a show than it is for a movie. There's more chance to recover in a show because by the end of episode 8, 6 weeks from now, we could be like, oh man, yeah, that was awesome when
Yeah.
it slows down, right? And then you don't really remember the beginning. When you're in a movie, every time you rewatch the movie or, only being 2 hours later, I was still like, "Oh my god, The Rise of Skywalker, that beginning really threw me off," right? Um, that's something that's going to be less remembered by the time you get to the very end if the rest of the show is well paced too. Colton says world building is what makes the prequels great, so kind of worried how sped up the pace is. Hey, that's the opposite side, right? And I think it's very fair. I That is one of my big concerns about the future of this show with the pacing. I agree with Finn that we won't remember how poorly paced the first episode is or how weirdly these episodes end if that stops, right? If the everything moving forward is better, then we won't remember as much the beginning, right? We won't hold it as strongly against the end. But if everything else is sparse because the pacing is so weird, I think you will remember it and it will be more impactful. So I'm hoping that that's not the case.
Yeah. Yeah. I can only hope.
David says, I think they've begun some Jedi Republic world building, like Vern is concerned about keeping the investigation quiet, showing the Jedi already concerned about politics. Yeah, that's a good point. And it's definitely something I wrote down in my notes as well. It's There's a lot of for Vernestra being a part of that golden age of the Republic, right? There's a lot of things she says and does in these episodes that are kind of part of that prequel look to the Jedi. She is worried about politics. She is kind of that mediator between Soul and the Council. She is forming her own council. She argues for why they should have discussion instead of action. It's interesting, especially for where Vernestra is in the books currently where we're reading them. It doesn't necessarily align with her character, to be honest. But this is 100 years later, so a lot has changed in her life since then. And she might kind of see that older perspective, right? So, interesting choice. Interesting to make this character Vernestra. I'm hoping they also use Vernestra, not just the light whip, but like, why is this Vernestra? I hope they kind of give a little bit more to that than just a nod to an old Republic or a High Republic character. Yeah, it's great, and I love seeing old High Republic characters that we've read about. But at the same time, I'm hoping some of that actual Vernestra character shines through because I haven't yet necessarily seen it in this version.
Yeah, yeah, and it is the question of, like, why is she alive 100 years later, right? We've never really expected the Marillions to be a species that lasts this long. We've had an idea that they live longer than humans and other similar humanoid species, but for her to be looking this great 100 years after where we're currently at in the High Republic, it it's like, okay, then where is she by the time of the prequels if she's doing this well, right? Does Is it just
Yeah.
like the last 50 years of her life, everything just goes wrong and, they become old and decrepit? We don't know yet, right? And there is a lot of mystery to her as well, 'cause, if you've really read, like, the Phase 2 High Republic comics, they're on Jedha, right? And Jedha's such a big part of canon since its introduction in Rogue One, with this being like a place for all these force cultures in the galaxy to kind of come together, have communion with each other, and like discuss and talk about the force and how their perspectives differ, their abilities, what they've learned, their knowledge, all this and that, right? So is the politics about the Republic? I don't know, because when I heard that line, like, and from just what we know about her character and her personality, it almost feels like maybe she's thinking more about the politics of other force cultures or other organizations or powers that may be more active at this point,
Mhm.
100 years before the Phantom Menace, but maybe are not around by the time of the Phantom Menace, right?
Mhm.
For who all we know, right, they might have a connection with the Mountain Clan on Dathomir and not the Night Sisters, and the Night Sisters are in response, kinda recruited by Palpatine to become a little bit more of like, "Hey, you wanna, like, join up forces and share our knowledge? Because these Jedi are, like, getting a little too much involved in kinda setting and establishing things with other cultures that we used to be able to, like, pull candidates from so much more easily." Like, this could just be a
Mhm.
way of, like, democratizing force, but also, like, colonializing it because you're like, well, these are like candidates for being most risk for like pirates, like the Nile or and Evereni and all the Path of the Open Hand. We've seen these other groups that have involved the Force, but have actually caused more trouble than beneficial evolution of our understanding.
Yeah, those are all fair points as well. And so that's another thing, just the world building of this time. I want to see it flesh out. We got to add more to it. Don't just skip ahead. I mean, yeah, you could say it's fair to save it for season two, but if we never get season two, I feel like this is a missed opportunity. And it will be like yet again another Star Wars story that's kind of like lacking on the detail, and we're gonna fill it in later. So I hope that's not the case. Still 6 episodes left. Still staying very optimistic. Colt says the Book of Boba Fett was only flashbacks for the first few episodes, or mostly flashbacks. I would say, Colt.
Yeah.
Acolyte feels like the opposite, and yeah, I think you're kind of right. Where they're building to like the climax of the show, or one of the first climax of maybe the first half of the show, being the reveal about what did happen during the fire. I think that's what they're building to. Whether that happens in episode 4 or 5, it would seem like something that big to be revealed wouldn't necessarily be shown to press, because if it did get leaked, it would kind of ruin the first 4 episodes. So they might save that for episode 5. I could see that being saved for 5. But I do think it changes the way we look at the show. It changes the outcome, and it sets us up ultimately for what the finale will be building towards for the second half of the series.
And on the other hand, right, we have heard from some of these reviewers who got the chance to see 4 episodes instead of 2. They talked a lot about how 3 was like, "Man, that's such an episode that I can't stop talking about," right? And it hasn't necessarily
Good to
been
hear.
polarizing, but it has been, like, notable, right? And I'd almost think the flashback then slots in there, or at least a big chunk of the flashback, right? Maybe that's, like, the first stage of understanding how the events that led to the fire that we've been talking so much about in the first 2 episodes, like, what were those things that were coming into play before? And then we maybe see the second half of it when it's more relevant to, like, the second act of this show, right? I don't know. Like, we don't necessarily have to have it all at once. I don't think we're gonna get like oh, Rashomon-esque thing, but we might just chunk it out as relevant when as it's relevant to the character.
Right. Definitely. Anthony says Darth Tenebris not only had Darth Plagueis as apprentice, but also Darth Venemus. He did have Darth Venemus. It is unconfirmed and definitely alluded to that Venemus was kind of a backup plan to a Plagueis. Like Plagueis was his guy, and Venemus was somebody he trained in case Plagueis didn't work out. So it is very much so possible that there are more than two Sith at a time. Like that's not something that we, or I feel strongly about. Like if there's three Sith in this show, it's not necessarily it doesn't necessarily break canon or legends, because that's something that we've seen already happen. It's just that somebody might think they're a Sith and they're not actually a Sith. And that's kind of what is alluded to with Venemus. It's one of the things that led Plagueis to have the idea to tell Palpatine to train Maul. Maul, Palpatine is given Maul in on Dathomir in the book. He brings him and he's thinking about hiding him from Plagueis, but he doesn't. He shows Plagueis. Plagueis like, train this guy on the dark side, and he can be a valuable asset to us. Maul never knows Plagueis exists, but Palpatine trains Maul, makes him think that he's actually his apprentice when in fact he is not. Palpatine's really the apprentice. So Maul's not the apprentice until like after Padme leaves to go back to Naboo in the Phantom Menace. That's when, spoilers, Plagueis dies. So ultimately there's a lot of perspective you can play with the Sith thing. It has to be one true master, one true apprentice, and then there can be everybody else who thinks like, Ventress isn't a Sith, but she wants to be Sith, especially in Legends. She wants to be Sith, and she knows she's working towards that. So we'll see. But Venemus, I really don't ever feel, as somebody who loves that book and read it a couple times, I never felt like Venemus is actually a Sith, a true Sith.
Nothing I can add there.
Okay, so we're gonna go a few more minutes. The hour 45 mark, I think, is where we're going to look to cut it off. So, I mean, we appreciate everybody's support. Want to get in a couple last questions before we cut it off. Make sure you send in super chats. We can get to them before we turn off here. It supports the channel, helps us out. But again, that's completely optional, up to you. We'd appreciate your support if you do intend to send one in, but make sure you do so soon because we are going to wrap it up here pretty quick for this week's stream. But again, come back next week, 7 p.m. Pacific. We will be talking about the Acolyte episode 3, and stay tuned for our official predictions and speculations. We've predicted and speculated a lot in this stream, so we'll have to gather our thoughts, form real predictions for episode 3 specifically, and then we'll be back with that video here soon for you all too. Peric says, the Jedi Order feels so different for only being 100 years before episode 1. The style of the outfits and ships feel like it would be 300 years at least, like it's set at the beginning of the High Republic. The outfits definitely look similar, and the ships have variations, I would say, on things we've seen, like the Trade Federation ships we see in this episode. Variations of what we see coming towards the Phantom Menace, but it does seem like the galaxy changes a lot once the High Republic era, as you know, historians would define it, right, ends. You would expect a large shift, right? If the galaxy was mostly about expansion, maybe there wasn't as much emphasis on changing technology or changing appearance. I mean, the era was so good, right? Why mess with it? That's maybe my headcanon way of looking at it, but the Jedi robes are very High Republic. I like that they changed to like combat robes. You have your white robes for when you're in the temple. You've got your combat black, gold, and white robes. I like that they kind of change styles and change looks depending on what missions they're going for. I think that's pretty cool, but ultimately I do love that they're keeping the white and gold aesthetic from the High Republic as the era officially ends. I don't want it to be completely different. Maybe a bit more of a bridge between the two, but I do like seeing these robes in live action.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that if we had like a little bit more time with the vector and could have seen it as opposed to like the flyby,
Yeah.
I we'd be able to say like, oh, there's a little bit more of a transition. This looks like we're kind of starting to go to that Delta 7 starfighter look more, right? But we don't know if it's even the same company. I don't think so. You know, there is those questions. There are those things about like why does it feel so different? But I don't know, I felt the Trade Federation one looked very close to what I expect the prequels.
Mhm.
And I know people are talking about the Jedi Temple, they're like, "Oh, man, like, everything's lowered and now the Jedi Temple just how could that happen 100 years?" I'm like, "Well, I don't know, and again, where you have, like, super Star Destroyers and all that, I think raising 4 floors is not like a crazy thing in 100 years." So, yeah, I mean, and if you look at the real world too, like, in 2024, can we really say that someone in 1924 would have predicted us streaming and talking
Right.
about all these things on like TV that's color. Like they didn't even have black and white films like as a consistent thing, and they were still like in the early days of like the
They didn't have
Nickelodeon,
sound.
right? They didn't have sound. Yeah, so it's like for them to be like, "What do you mean movie franchise? Like, what are you ta that's a thing? What's a movie? We got these silence, and there's some rumor about these talkies coming out, right? Like, what do you mean? Like, you pay us what's a subscription?" Like, all of these things would be, like, such, like, a confusing thing, right? And,
Yeah.
you know, we didn't have, like, cars, we didn't have all these things, like, as a common thing in our lives just 100 years ago, and we can
Yeah. World
say,
War
like,
II hadn't
"Oh,
happened yet.
yeah, World War II hadn't happened yet," right? Like,
The world was very
in a
different.
way, war like, that's a it's a great point that you bring up there, like, war sometimes facilitates development, right? It just forces things to change and happen once you destroy it, so, yeah, we're in a period that is peaceful, so now the question is how are they gonna show that, like, they moved away from that High Republic aesthetic that has been, like, very strongly established in Phase 1 and Phase 2 and Phase 3, and kinda go into the prequels without, like, a big crazy thing happening, right? Maybe that's where the Trade Federation starts becoming more of a player at the end of the season or, like, in season
Mhm.
2, right? We don't know.
Yeah, and that's why I hope the show keeps going on, because I think I'm not expecting this season of the Acolyte to bridge the gap between the High Republic and the Phantom Menace. I'm more so expecting it to end the High Republic than I am to connect to the Phantom Menace. But I think there needs to be some emphasis on world building this season more so than they're showing now, but it doesn't necessarily mean they have to explain everything, right? They just need to give us a little taste, a little bit of what this is like at the time. And they have done so, like you're saying, in some shots, but we'll see what they do with the rest of the season. I'm very much so intrigued. Like for for two episodes that I wouldn't say I loved, but I did like, I'm surprised how like excited I am for the next
Yeah.
6 weeks. Like I'm expecting this to be really different. I think that's why it's different, and it's going to be exciting to have something where we don't necessarily know the ending. We don't know what's going to happen to these characters. The last question, I think, for the stream, everybody. So unless you send in a super chat, the bump yours to the top. We're gonna have to wrap it up after this question. But thank you so much for joining. Again, next week, come back for episode 3 discussion, 7 p.m. Pacific, and we will be discussing everything that happens. And stay tuned for our predictions video. David Fieldson says, "Do you guys think there's any chance that Master Soul is the red blade wielder? I got weird vibes when he was confronting May about the identity of her master, like he was testing her to see if she'd break." I personally never got those vibes, David. That's a really interesting point, and it would completely throw this show on its head if that were the case, like completely. So I, part of me would love a big twist like that because it would be a huge swing, and it would be something that would change the way you watch the show. It would hopefully, make the show even more interesting down the road. But I don't know if I got those vibes personally from those scenes. I'll have to go back and rewatch them. But I do think, just like the thing that I was kind of hoping when the show started, that there was this like, dissociative identity thing, like May and Osha, two sides of the same person, some type of Sith mind control, the witches, what could they be doing to mess with Osha and May's minds? But now that, we have it confirmed that all these other characters also see May and Osha in the same time, um, it's, not going to happen. But I think it would be interesting to see that plot point put there just with a different character. I'm just not sure if I see it yet in the show with Saul.
Yeah. Yeah. That's fair. And I think Soul is the character of the Jedi that we've seen so far that was involved with this issue 16 years prior. He's got guilt. He's got guilt with how he's handled OSHA's training too, right? Like, when they talk about her tattoo, right? Not
Mhm.
it almost seems like it should be like, "Oh, like, hey, you got a tattoo?" And she's like, "Yeah, it was a crazy night." But then it, like, becomes very negative pretty quickly. It's like, "No, like, that's how are like, well, why are you like this? Or, like, why aren't you, like, listening to my advice?" Like, it almost becomes, like, something that feels a lot more contentious and, like, whatever happened 16 years ago, no matter how hard he tried, no matter how hard she tried, he, like, held it against her, or he truth or whatever happened that he had was covered up to some degree, right? And he couldn't, like, separate himself from that. Like, a big thing that it tells Jackie is, like she's like, "Why do you have hollows of your Padawan?" And he's like,
Right.
"Oh, yeah, because it's like, we learn from our past, right? We shouldn't forget it and erase it." But learning doesn't necessarily come from having reminders constantly. Sometimes you have to have a disconnect, to be able to heal and move on, but I don't think he has. I think having OSHA be brought back, he's trying his best, but everything going on, seeing his friends die, right? Like, knowing that he is a target too, he's under a lot of strain, and I think we've
Yeah.
seen in the previews, he's clearly gonna be fighting against the masked figure at some point with a bunch of other Jedi. I think he's gonna be the last person, and it might almost be like this master's like, "Alright, so maybe I'll finish the job, I guess I'll do it." Maybe that's where he'll finally get some sort of release, right? And be
Mhm.
able to ask these questions or ask someone else who truly could understand what happened 16 years ago, and maybe May's there, right? We don't know yet, but, I don't see him as wielding the red saber other than maybe, like, if he, like, grabs it from the ground after, like, defeating this Darksider or something, but yeah,
Yeah.
it's gonna be very interesting to see what he hasn't told us about, right? What he's been hiding, what has been weighing him down.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's that guilt for sure that's throughout both these episodes. It's the way he talks about respecting the power of the force when you first see him with the kids, that that idea of maybe, even Jedi like us can make a mistake because we underestimate how powerful we are, how much of a gift we have, how we handle situations. Maybe we're not prepared for it always. There's hints of that. There's grief, there's sorrow, and there's definitely regret. And he spends these entire 2 episodes ultra focused on Osha, trying to fix things he messed up. And the show definitely wants you to think it's more so because he feels like he failed as a master, right? She leaves and he feels like he failed as a master. And that's part of it. But there's something there. He feels guilty about something that happened.
Yeah.
Even if he doesn't necessarily think he's the one at fault, he blames himself for either letting it happen or blames himself for being involved with it. And we're going to ultimately see what that is. But that's going to wrap up our stream for episodes 1 and 2 of The Acolyte. Thank you so much for joining this inaugural stream for The Acolyte. Make sure you join us. 6 more weeks of Acolyte coverage. We'll be talking about episodes 3 through 8 for the entirety of these episodes. We'll be streaming and we'll be discussing and predicting and taking all your guys' questions live in this format for an hour and a half to 2 hours like we did tonight. So make sure you join us next week on June 11th to discuss The Acolyte episode 3. Stay tuned for our predictions and speculation about the next episode. If you want to check out some other videos we have coming, Sonic has a prediction or a theory video about Ventress's return and what this might mean for the future of Star Wars. We also have the second episode of my Legends timeline series, probably the most ambitious timeline I've ever done for one of my channels. So stay tuned for that if you're interested. Especially it goes well with the Acolyte because it does cover the Legends time between the Old Republic and the Phantom Menace. So it would be the Legend stuff that's taking place during what you're watching with the Acolyte. So if you want to check out that timeline video. It's coming as well. And then we have even more great content coming for you. Also tying into the Acolyte, we have our review of Temptation of the Force, which will be out next week before the book is released on Monday. So make sure you stay tuned for that video as well. And hopefully you're all enjoying your week and enjoying the rise of Star Wars back into the pop culture conversation. Should be a fun next few weeks discussing the Acolyte. Hopefully you all join us and stay with us this entire time. If you had fun with the stream and you're new, make sure you subscribe. You like the video, helps us out. And you come back, join us live, tell your friends, join us live, send in your questions. You can get your questions featured on the show, and we'll give you our opinions and definitely directly interact with you guys just as much as you guys hopefully enjoy interacting with us. So thank you so much for watching this stream and this video, and we will see you all next week for episode 3. Good night,